You can think of AvePoint Online Services as your cloud platform, even a cloud operating system that you use to host the various services and solutions you license from AvePoint that support your Microsoft 365 deployments. In order for AOS and all of its services, though, to be able to communicate with your tenant for the purposes of things like backup, reporting, governance, and so on, you need to establish an authentication method. You need to essentially provide, as the first step, AvePoint Online Services, the mechanism through which it will communicate with the Microsoft 365 tenant. When we log on to AOS for the first time, over on the left-hand side, under Management, we can do that through App Management and Service Account. Now, the service account is kind of your classic service account, and it works in exactly the same way it would have on-prem. Classically in on-prem, you create the account, you provide it with permissions, but you don't give those credentials to a user. Users are not logging on to a system with the service account. The service account is used for a system to log on to and work within another system. If, for instance, you're familiar with our DocAv platform for on-prem management of SharePoint, you know that the DocAv agents require the service account to log on to SharePoint essentially like super users to do everything that they need to be able to do: backup, management, reporting, archiving, and so on. Not a new concept. However, in cloud, service accounts don't perform as well as they do on closed networks. And people worry about storing the credentials for an account that essentially has global administrator permission. That's the easiest way to do the service account, but you don't have to, of course. You can be very granular with the permissions if you'd like to, but a lot of organizations will provide it the global admin role so that all the different tools can do whatever they need to do without incident. But again, the challenge is now those credentials are stored somewhere and they're passed between AOS and Microsoft 365 to log in. That's how service accounts work. Instead, Microsoft created a newer model, which is called app authentication. The way that it works from AOS to Microsoft 365 is under Management, we go to App Management, and we click Create, and we're provided with a series of options. Essentially, what's going to happen here is AvePoint Online Services will install its app in your Microsoft 365 tenant. Now, the reason why we do that is so that way, whenever something like Cloud Backup, whenever something like Policies and Insights has to reach out to your tenant in order to perform its job, rather than having to pass the username and password, those services are already recognized because the AvePoint app is already installed and running within your Microsoft 365 tenant. Essentially, those services are allowed to authenticate in and do their jobs because they're recognized and trusted. Now, the default app is Microsoft 365. All of our services require this one. So at the bare minimum, this is going to be the one to install. I'll talk about the others in a few minutes. So we're going to leave Microsoft 365 selected. And then down at the bottom, you see you've got a couple of choices around permissions: SharePoint Online, Exchange Online. The reason why you might switch between those is if you're being super selective about the service that you're using. An example would be if you're running our cloud backup tool, but you're not backing up anything at all except for maybe SharePoint and OneDrive. If you're backing up other things, though, like Teams, for instance, and of course Exchange, in addition to your various SharePoint sources, then you'll want to leave it set to all permissions. For customers who are very, very, very specific about the permissions they want, they have a couple of ways to get that done. One way would be they could build their own custom app in Azure ahead of time. It's under Enterprise Apps in Azure AD. They could create the app, associate the permissions that they want to allow, and then come in here and connect to that already existing app. The easiest thing, though, is to do the pre-built app. So I'm going to leave that selected and click OK. And now it's prompting me for Microsoft credentials. These are the credentials for a global administrator account. Now that might seem strange, and it might look like it's going to capture those credentials almost like a service account, but it's not. What's actually happening here is it is asking you for your credentials simply because it needs you to authorize the installation of the app. It's asking for your credentials to log on to Microsoft 365 and put the app in there. It is not capturing the global administrator credentials during this process. It is simply asking you to allow it to do what it's trying to do. So I'm going to provide my global admin email address and password here, and click sign in. Now here are all of the permissions that that app is going to possess in your Microsoft 365 tenant. If it looks good, I click accept. It takes me back to AOS, and you can see that it tells me that my profile is now in place. To verify that, we should now actually go and log on to our Microsoft 365 tenant and take a look in Azure AD under our enterprise apps. So I'm going to click into a different browser so we can do that. And you can see here I'm already logged in. So now if I go up to my app launcher, to admin, and in the admin console, we go to all and Azure Active Directory. And finally, over on the left-hand side, we click Enterprise Applications. We see the AvePoint Online Services Administration app installed in there. Right, so again, that now allows the AOS tenant to authenticate into this Microsoft 365 tenant without the need to pass username and password like you would with a classic service account. Now, if I go back over to AOS, as we saw earlier in that create box, there are other types of apps as well. If you are using tools such as, for instance, our Sense tool for license management, you're going to need the Microsoft Azure AD app. If you're using cloud governance and you want to be able to pull the departments from your Azure AD to use as metadata as part of your services, you're going to need to add the Microsoft Azure AD app as well. And it's the same exact process. I would click that, OK, provide my credentials to authorize the app to be installed, and that's it, and it would be installed. If you're doing cloud backup for Dynamics, cloud backup for Salesforce, if you're using Yammer communities and you need them to be managed through cloud governance, all of these various apps, you create them here to provide the AOS platform the ability to communicate, authenticate into Microsoft 365 and talk with that service in the way that it needs to, so that the individual tools that you're using, one more time, cloud backup, cloud management, Sense, policies and insights, cloud governance, can do their jobs. Now, for the majority of those types of actions that our tools can take, the app will be sufficient. However, at the time of this recording, there may still be certain things that are only available through a service account. So we do recommend that you create a service account as well, just in case you run up against one of those things. Now, when I say run up against, what I mean is the tool will absolutely handle it. If cloud backup, for instance, is trying to do something with Exchange that can only be done through service account authentication and communication at the time, well, it will do everything else through the app connection, and then it will use the service account for that one thing that may not be supported at the time through the app communication. The good news is that Microsoft continues to add more functionality to app authentication. So at some point, the service accounts won't be necessary. Everything will be doable through the app method. Service accounts are super easy to configure as well. You literally just do the same thing you would classically have done on-prem. I can go over into my Azure AD, create a user, give the appropriate permissions as outlined in your AvePoint Online Services user guide, save that, come over here, click Create, and literally just put in the username and password. That's it. Right? And anytime in the future, if any of the AOS services require that service account, it will invoke it as necessary. But your primary method for authentication and communication remains your AvePoint apps. Now, in addition to apps and service accounts, another absolutely critical required setup component in AOS is auto discovery scan profiles. And we're going to take a look at the scan profiles in our next video. Thanks for watching.